The black SUV stopped at the end of the gravel road without raising a cloud of dust. The woman behind the wheel looked across the weathered fences, the aging red barn, and the wide Wyoming pasture where a small flock of sheep grazed beneath a pale autumn sky. Nothing about the property suggested it was worth $1 million. Yet it was the only piece of land she couldn't buy. Miles Calloway leaned against a fence post, replacing a broken wire while his 11-year-old daughter, Nora, carried a bucket of feed toward the animals. Their border collie darted happily through the field, completely unaware that a decision capable of changing their lives had just arrived at the front gate. The woman stepped out of the SUV wearing a tailored camel-colored coat and polished leather boots, looking more at home in a boardroom than on a ranch. "Mr. Calloway?" Miles straightened, wiped the dirt from his hands onto his jeans, and walked over with an easy smile. "That's me." She offered her hand. "My name is Vivian Sterling." He recognized the name immediately. Everyone in the county did. She had spent the past year purchasing ranches and farmland throughout the valley for a massive conservation and resort project that dominated every local newspaper. "I appreciate you driving all the way out here," she said. "I'd like to make one final offer." She opened a slim folder and placed a single document on the hood of her SUV. $1 million. The number sat between them in bold print. Enough to erase every loan on the ranch. Enough to send Nora to any college she dreamed of attending. Enough to replace every broken fence, every aging tractor, every sleepless night spent wondering how another winter would be paid for. Miles studied the paper for only a few seconds before closing the folder. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "This farm isn't for sale." There was no anger, no hesitation, only certainty. Vivian searched his face, almost expecting him to laugh or ask for twice the price. Instead, he simply handed the folder back. "Before we continue, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever faced a decision where money couldn't replace what truly mattered?" Vivian glanced across the property once more. "The offer is real," she said quietly. "I believe you. Most people would at least negotiate." Miles smiled. "Most people probably should." She waited for an explanation. None came. From the pasture, Nora called out that one of the lambs had slipped through a loose section of fencing. Miles excused himself without another word and walked toward his daughter, kneeling beside her as they patiently guided the frightened animal back into the field. Vivian watched from a distance. The fences were old. The barn roof needed repairs. The pickup truck parked beside the house had seen better decades. Nothing about the place suggested comfort or financial security. Yet the father and daughter moved through the ranch with the quiet rhythm of people who belonged there. As she climbed back into her SUV, Vivian looked at the folder resting on the passenger seat. For the first time in years, she wasn't wondering how much more she needed to offer. She was wondering what she had completely failed to understand. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than anyone expected. It wasn't enough to cover the valley, but a thin layer of white clung to the fence rails and the rooftops before the morning sun slowly melted it away. Miles Calloway stood outside the barn repairing a loose gate, while Nora carried fresh hay to the sheep. "You should let me do the heavy bales," Miles said. Nora rolled her eyes with a smile. "I'm 11, Dad. Not 5. You'll always be my kid." "That's exactly the problem." He laughed, and for a moment the weight pressing on his shoulders felt lighter. Inside the farmhouse, however, reality waited on the kitchen table. A stack of unpaid invoices. A property tax notice marked final reminder. An estimate for replacing the aging barn roof. Miles quietly gathered the papers before Nora walked inside. He didn't want her worrying about numbers she couldn't change. Later that morning, he drove into the small town nearby to pick up feed and replacement fencing. The owner of the feed store greeted him with the same friendly smile he always had. "You hear about Sterling's project?" the man asked while loading supplies into the truck. "Hard not to. They've bought almost everything south of the river." Miles nodded. "So I've heard. They'll probably come back." "I imagine they will." The conversation ended there. Miles wasn't interested in convincing anyone he had made the right decision. In truth, he asked himself the same question every night. On his way home, he stopped at the local bank to make a partial payment on an equipment loan. The amount barely covered the interest. As he walked back toward his pickup, he noticed a familiar black SUV parked across the street. Vivian Sterling stepped out carrying no briefcase, no folder, and no contract. Mr. Calloway. Miles is fine. She smiled politely. I wasn't planning to negotiate. Good. I was hoping you might answer one question. He leaned against the truck. I'll answer if I can. Why didn't you even consider the offer? Miles looked toward the snow-covered hills beyond town. If I'd taken the time to think about the money, I might have talked myself into something I'd regret. So you avoided thinking about it. I decided long before you arrived. Vivian studied him carefully. Most people would have asked for more. I'm not most people. She almost laughed. No, I suppose you're not. A cold breeze swept across the parking lot. Vivian noticed the worn tires on his truck and the faded stitching on his work jacket. Nothing about his life suggested comfort. Yet he carried himself with a quiet confidence she rarely saw in people negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. I'm staying in town for a few days, she said. If you ever change your mind, I'll let you know. She nodded and walked away. That afternoon, Nora found her father sitting alone on the back porch watching the sheep wander across the pasture. Can I ask you something? Always. If someone offered us enough money to fix everything. She hesitated. Would life be easier? Miles answered honestly. Some parts would. And the other parts? He looked across the land stretching toward the distant mountains. I'm still trying to figure that out. Nora accepted the answer without another question. She leaned her head against his shoulder as they watched the sunset paint the fields in shades of gold and amber. From the road beyond the pasture, Vivian's SUV slowed for just a moment before continuing toward town. She looked once more at the old farmhouse surrounded by weathered fences. For the first time in years, she realized the hardest properties to acquire were never protected by lawyers or contracts. They were protected by memories she couldn't yet see. 3 days passed before Vivian Sterling returned to the ranch. This time she arrived without an offer, without attorneys, and without the polished leather portfolio that had carried the million-dollar contract. Instead, she parked beside the weathered mailbox and walked toward the sheep pasture with a pair of work gloves tucked into her coat pocket. Miles noticed her from the barn. You planning to negotiate again? He asked with a faint smile. No. She held up the gloves. I was told lambing season doesn't wait for business meetings. He couldn't help smiling. Who told you that? The owner of the feed store. He talks too much. So I've learned. Miles looked at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering over the western hills, and a cold wind swept across the valley. If you're willing to get your boots dirty, I won't turn down another set of hands. For the next 2 hours, there was very little conversation. Vivian helped stack hay, carried buckets of fresh water, and watched Miles repair another broken section of fencing with practiced efficiency. Nothing about his work was dramatic. Every task was repetitive, physical, and necessary. Nora joined them after finishing her school assignments. You've never done farm work before, have you? She asked. Vivian laughed. Does it show? You tried feeding sheep with horse grain. I'll admit that wasn't my strongest moment. Even Miles chuckled. By lunchtime, the three of them sat outside on overturned feed buckets eating simple turkey sandwiches Nora had prepared that morning. Vivian looked across the rolling hills stretching beyond the ranch. It's beautiful here. It is, Miles agreed. But beautiful doesn't always pay the bills. No. She hesitated, before asking another question. If money isn't the reason you're staying, what is? Miles took his time before answering. I honestly don't know how to explain it. He looked toward the old farmhouse. My grandparents built that porch with lumber they cut themselves. He pointed toward a line of cottonwood trees. My daughter learned to ride her first horse between those trees. His eyes settled on the red barn. Every corner of this place reminds me of someone. Vivian nodded. I understand memories. Miles looked at her. I don't think you do. The words were calm, not cruel. She could have taken offense. Instead, she asked quietly, why do you say that? Because if you did, your first offer wouldn't have been about money. The sentence lingered in the cold afternoon air. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Before Vivian could respond, Nora came running from the pasture. Dad, a young lamb had slipped into a narrow drainage ditch after trying to follow the rest of the flock. Miles climbed down immediately, while Vivian steadied a rope from above. Working together, they carefully lifted the frightened animal back on a solid ground. When the lamb finally scrambled toward its mother, Nora laughed with relief. Vivian brushed mud from her coat and smiled. I definitely wasn't dressed for this. No, Miles admitted, but you stayed anyway. As the afternoon faded into evening, Vivian drove away with dried mud on her boots and hay clinging to the sleeves of her expensive coat. She had spent nearly 6 hours on a ranch she still hoped to purchase. Yet she hadn't mentioned the offer once. For the first time, she wasn't trying to understand why the land was valuable. She was trying to understand why the people living on it believed its value could never be measured by a price alone. The weather turned colder overnight. A sharp wind swept across the Wyoming Valley, carrying the unmistakable warning that winter would arrive sooner than anyone hoped. Miles spent the morning reinforcing the sheep shelter while Nora searched the attic for extra blankets they stored every fall. She opened an old cedar chest tucked beneath the sloping roof. Inside were family photographs, faded Christmas ornaments, and several leather-bound journals wrapped carefully in a wool scarf she immediately recognized. "Mom's scarf," she whispered. Miles climbed the attic stairs when he heard her call. For a long moment, neither of them touched the journals. They had belonged to Emily. After she passed away, Miles had packed away many of her personal things because reading them felt like reopening a wound he wasn't ready to face. Nora gently picked up the smallest journal. "I think Mom would want us to read these." Miles slowly nodded. They carried the journals downstairs and sat together at the kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows. Most entries described ordinary days: lambing season, school concerts, Sunday dinners, and dreams of planting more apple trees near the house. Then Nora stopped turning pages. "Dad," she slid the journal toward him. A paragraph near the end had been underlined. "If this land ever becomes something we protect more than the people we love, I hope you'll choose our family first. A home is never just the soil beneath our feet. It's the life we build together." Miles read the words twice, then a third time. His hands trembled slightly. For years, he had believed keeping every acre untouched was the only way to honor Emily's memory. Every difficult decision, every loan, every repaired fence had been measured against that promise. But nowhere in her journal did she ask him to sacrifice their future. She had written about preserving love, not preserving ownership at any cost. Later that afternoon, Vivian arrived unexpectedly, intending only to return a pair of work gloves she had borrowed days earlier. She immediately sensed something had changed. Miles invited her onto the porch. Neither of them mentioned the offer. Instead, he looked across the field stretching toward the distant mountains. "I've been holding on to something for so long," he said quietly, "that I never stopped to ask whether I was holding on to the right thing." Vivian didn't interrupt. She simply listened. For the first time since they had met, the conversation was no longer about buying land. It had become a conversation about what people inherit, what they remember, and how easily love can be mistaken for obligation when grief has been carrying the weight for too many years. Vivian returned to the ranch the following Saturday, carrying nothing but a thermos of coffee and a folded county map. Miles looked surprised when he opened the front gate. "I thought you'd be meeting with architects." "I postponed it." "Because of me?" She shook her head. "Because I realized I've been making decisions about this valley without understanding the people who actually live here." Nora waved from the porch before heading toward the sheep pasture with the border collie racing beside her. Miles invited Vivian to sit beneath the old cottonwood tree near the house. It was one of the few places on the ranch where Emily had insisted on placing a weathered wooden bench years earlier. For several minutes, they simply watched the wind move through the golden grass. Finally, Vivian broke the silence. "I owe you an explanation." Miles waited. "My father grew up on a farm in eastern Montana." She smiled faintly. "He hated leaving it." "What happened?" "The bank took it after 3 years of drought." She lowered her eyes. "I was only 9, but I remember him standing in an empty field after the auction. He promised himself that if he ever had the chance to protect land from disappearing under endless development, he would. So this project started as his dream." Miles nodded slowly. "And somewhere along the way, it became your responsibility." She looked at him, surprised by how quickly he understood. "I've spent years convincing myself I was honoring him." "Were you?" Vivian didn't answer immediately. "I'm not sure anymore." The question lingered between them. Miles reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the page from Emily's journal he had copied the night before. "I've been asking myself the same thing." He handed it to her. Vivian read the passage carefully before returning the paper. "She sounds like someone who understood the difference between preserving a place and preserving a family." "She always did." Miles looked toward Nora, who was laughing as one of the lambs chased the family dog across the pasture. I thought keeping every acre was how I stayed faithful to her. And now, I think I confused love with fear. The word surprised even him. Fear of forgetting. Fear of moving forward. Fear that changing the ranch meant leaving Emily behind. Vivian quietly poured 2 cups of coffee from the thermos. You know, she said, my project has one problem. Only one. She laughed. The master plan only works if I own every parcel inside the valley. I figured as much. But that's because we designed it around efficiency. She unfolded the county map across the bench. What if efficiency isn't the only goal? Miles studied the map. The proposed resort surrounded his ranch from 3 directions. Trails crossed nearby creeks. Guest cabins overlooked the hills where his sheep grazed. It could be redesigned, Vivian admitted. It would cost more. It would. It would take longer. Yes. So why even consider it? Vivian looked across the valley. Because if preserving nature means erasing the families who cared for it before I arrived, then I'm not preserving anything that truly matters. Miles remained silent. For the first time since they had met, neither of them was trying to persuade the other. They were questioning themselves instead. As the afternoon faded, Nora walked back carrying a basket of apples from the small orchard behind the farmhouse. She handed one to Vivian. These came from the first tree Mom planted. Vivian turned the apple slowly in her hands. It wasn't perfect. Its skin carried tiny marks from the changing weather. Yet somehow it felt more valuable than anything that could be listed in a financial report. Driving away that evening, Vivian left the unsigned purchase agreement locked inside her briefcase. For the first time since launching the project, she instructed her design team not to prepare another offer. Instead, she asked them a question no one had expected. What would this valley look like if we built our future around the people who already belong here? The first heavy snowfall arrived 2 weeks later. By sunrise, the pastures had disappeared beneath a blanket of white, and the old fence posts stood like dark markers across the valley. Miles was clearing snow from the barn doors when Nora hurried outside with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. You've been out here since dawn. So have the sheep. She handed him a mug and looked toward the distant hills. Do you think she'll come back? Miles knew exactly who she meant. I don't know. And if she does? He smiled. I still don't have all the answers. Later that morning, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. It wasn't Vivian. It was Caleb Morrison, the lead engineer for Sterling Land Holdings. He stepped out carrying a large rolled blueprint. I'm not here to convince you to sell, Caleb said before Miles could speak. Ms. Sterling asked me to show you something. Together, they spread the blueprint across the workbench inside the barn. Miles immediately noticed something different. The proposed resort no longer covered his entire property. Trails curved around the family orchard. The old farmhouse remained untouched. The creek running through the ranch had been left inside a protected conservation corridor. Caleb pointed to the revised layout. She asked us to redesign everything without assuming your land would be included. Miles looked up in surprise. That must have taken weeks. It did. And it costs more. Caleb gave a small smile. A lot more. After he left, Miles studied the map for a long time. For the first time, he realized Vivian had changed something important before asking him to change anything. That evening, Vivian called. I heard Caleb stopped by. He did. I wasn't trying to persuade you. I know. I needed to know whether my project could still reflect what my father believed in, even if I never owned your ranch. Miles stood on the porch while snow drifted quietly across the fields. I appreciate that. There was a pause. I've been thinking about Emily's journal, Vivian admitted. So have I. You once told me I didn't understand memories. I did. Were you right? Miles considered the question carefully. I think I was. And now, I think you're trying to. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. Finally, Vivian spoke again. If there were a solution that honored your family and still allowed the valley to move forward, would you at least be willing to hear it? Miles looked toward the small orchard where Nora was brushing snow from the young apple trees her mother had planted years earlier. He realized something had quietly changed inside him. He was no longer refusing because he was afraid of letting go. He was refusing because he hadn't yet found the right way to move forward. Yes, he answered at last. I'll listen. When the call ended, Nora walked onto the porch and slipped her hand into his. Did you change your mind? Miles smiled gently. No. He looked across the peaceful ranch before continuing. I changed the question. Instead of asking whether the farm should be sold, he had begun asking what kind of future would allow his daughter to inherit not only the land's history, but also the freedom to build a life that honored it without becoming trapped by it. For the first time since Vivian had driven through the front gate with $1 million offer, that felt like the beginning of the answer. The meeting took place on a quiet Tuesday morning inside the old county library. Vivian had suggested neutral ground. No corporate offices. No lawyers seated at the table. No pressure. Just a place where ideas could be discussed before decisions were made. Miles arrived with Nora carrying a worn leather folder that held copies of Emily's journal and the original deed to the ranch. Vivian was already waiting with Caleb Morrison and a rolled set of revised site plans. As everyone settled into their seats, Vivian pushed the blueprints aside. I'd rather hear your proposal first. Miles looked surprised. I thought this was your project. It is. She smiled gently. But this valley isn't. He unfolded a hand-drawn map instead of legal documents. This is what I've been thinking about. He pointed to the center of the page. The farmhouse stays. Next came the orchard. The trees Emily planted stay too. He traced a line along the creek. This water has supported neighboring ranches for generations. Public access to the fishing trail should never disappear. Caleb leaned closer, studying every detail. Miles continued. The western pasture isn't essential to our family anymore. If that land becomes part of your conservation project, I'm willing to discuss it. Vivian listened without interrupting. There is one condition, Miles added. The history of this valley can't be erased. He looked directly at her. I don't want visitors believing this land began the day construction starts. Vivian slowly nodded. What are you asking? A small heritage center. She waited. Nothing expensive. Just a place where families who built these ranches are remembered. Photographs. Old tools. Stories. Names. Nora quietly placed one of Emily's journals on the table. My mom used to say memories disappear faster than buildings. The room fell silent. Vivian looked at the journal for a long moment. Then she closed her own notebook. I accept. Caleb glanced toward her. Without revisions? There will be revisions. She smiled. But not to his conditions. Instead, she reached for Miles' map. We'll redesign around them. The engineer nodded thoughtfully. It'll take more planning. It usually does, Vivian replied. When you're trying to respect something instead of replace it. Snow drifted gently outside the library windows as the conversation continued for another 2 hours. No one argued over purchase price. No one tried to gain leverage. The discussion centered on boundaries, shared responsibility, and preserving the character of the valley while allowing it to evolve. When the meeting finally ended, Vivian gathered the blueprints but left the unsigned purchase agreement inside her briefcase. She no longer wanted Miles to choose between his past and his future. She wanted to help create a path where both could exist together. Outside, Nora looked across the snow-covered fields stretching toward the mountains. Do you think Mom would have liked today? Miles took a deep breath before answering. I think she'd be proud that we finally stopped asking how to protect the land. He looked at his daughter with a quiet smile and started asking how the land could keep protecting the people who call it home. For the first time since the $1 million offer had been placed on the hood of an SUV, the negotiation no longer felt like a transaction. It felt like the beginning of a shared promise, one written not in dollars, but in trust. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the valley. The snow still rested on the distant mountain peaks, but streams of melting water flowed through the meadows, feeding the creek that had crossed the Callaway Ranch for generations. Along the fences, patches of green grass pushed through the frozen ground, carrying the first signs of spring. Construction had not begun. That surprised many people in town. Rumors spread that Vivian Sterling's project had stalled because one stubborn rancher refused to sell. Others claimed the investors had backed out. The truth was far quieter. The plans were being redrawn. Every trail, every cabin, every scenic overlook was being adjusted around the boundaries that Miles and Vivian had agreed should remain untouched. One afternoon, Vivian arrived at the ranch carrying a long cardboard tube. I thought you might want to see the final draft. Miles spread the new plans across the kitchen table while Nora leaned over his shoulder. The farmhouse stood exactly where it always had. The orchard remained untouched. The old creek continued through protected land, without fences blocking public access. A narrow walking trail curved gently around the property instead of cutting across it. At the edge of the drawing, Nora noticed a small building. "What's this?" Vivian smiled. "It wasn't my idea." She looked toward Miles. "It was yours." The building was labeled simply, Valley Heritage House. Not a museum, not a tourist attraction, just a small place where photographs, journals, farming tools, and family stories from the valley could be preserved for future generations. Miles traced the outline with one finger. "You really kept it. I promised I would." A few weeks later, county officials approved the revised proposal. The vote wasn't unanimous. Some believed Vivian was giving away too much land that could have generated additional revenue. Others argued that preserving the ranch's historic center would make the entire valley more meaningful rather than less profitable. Vivian accepted both opinions, without trying to win every argument. For the first time in years, success no longer meant controlling every outcome. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued much as it always had. Miles repaired fences, fed sheep before sunrise, changed broken boards on the barn. Nora finished her schoolwork each afternoon before helping in the orchard. Yet something inside the house felt lighter. The unopened bills no longer carried the same quiet fear. The conversations around the dinner table no longer circled back to impossible choices. One Saturday morning, Nora carried Emily's journal onto the porch. "I've been thinking." Miles looked up from sharpening a pair of pruning shears. "That's usually dangerous." She laughed. "What if we leave copies of Mom's recipes in the Heritage House?" He smiled. "So people know she wasn't just part of history." "Exactly. They'll know she baked the best apple pie in 3 counties. And they'll know she burned pancakes almost every Sunday." Miles laughed harder than he had in months. "I'd forgotten about that." "No," Nora said softly. "You remembered. You just stopped remembering only the sad parts." The words stayed with him long after she walked back inside. Later that evening, Vivian stood alone on a hill overlooking the valley. The revised project would earn less money than the original plan. She knew that. Her investors knew it too. But watching the sunset stretch across the preserved ranch, the orchard, and the winding creek, she realized something unexpected. For years she had measured success by how much land could be brought together under one vision. Now she understood that real stewardship sometimes meant leaving part of the landscape exactly where it belonged. Not every boundary was an obstacle. Some were promises worth protecting. As the first stars appeared above the valley, the lights from the Callaway farmhouse glowed warmly in the distance. They no longer represented land she couldn't buy. They represented a family that had finally found a future without feeling forced to abandon its past. Spring arrived quietly, almost as if the valley itself had decided not to rush into a new season. Wildflowers began appearing along the creek that wound through the Callaway ranch. The orchard Emily had planted years before blossomed for the first time since Miles could remember without bringing him overwhelming sadness. He still missed her every day, but grief no longer felt like a chain holding him in place. It had become a gentle reminder of a life that had been deeply loved. Construction on Vivian Sterling's conservation project finally began, though anyone expecting towering gates or rows of luxury buildings would have been surprised. The walking trails curved naturally around the Callaway farmhouse. The century-old cottonwood trees remained untouched. The creek continued to flow freely through protected land, just as generations of ranchers had known it. One Saturday morning, the small Valley Heritage House opened its doors. There were no grand speeches or television cameras. Neighbors simply gathered with framed photographs, handmade quilts, worn saddles, family journals, and stories that might otherwise have disappeared with time. Miles placed Emily's favorite cast-iron pie pan beside a handwritten recipe for her apple pie. Nora smiled. Mom would have laughed if she knew this old pan ended up behind glass. Miles chuckled. She would have told everyone to use it instead. Across the room, Vivian carefully studied the displays. She noticed that every family had contributed something different. No single story was more important than another. Together, they explained why the valley mattered. She walked over to Miles. "I spent years believing ownership was the best way to protect a place. And now, I think belonging is stronger than ownership." Miles nodded. "I think you're right." Outside, children ran between the orchard and the creek while older residents shared memories beneath the shade of the cottonwood trees. The land had changed, but it had not lost its identity. Instead, it had made room for both memory and tomorrow. Later that afternoon, Miles and Nora planted a young maple tree near the fence where Emily had once dreamed of building a swing. Nora pressed the last handful of soil around its roots. "Do you think this tree will still be here when I'm old?" Miles smiled. "If someone cares for it, it will." She looked across the valley. "I will." As the sun settled behind the Wyoming hills, Vivian quietly prepared to leave. Before getting into her truck, she turned back toward the ranch one last time. She no longer saw the only property she couldn't buy. She saw a family that had taught her the difference between possession and purpose. Watching from a distance, I believe this story is not really about $1 million offer or a piece of land. It is about the choices that reveal who we are when money, fear, and memory pull us in different directions. It is also a reminder that every person deserves respect, whether they live in a modest farmhouse or a luxurious estate. Wealth may change the opportunities people have, but it does not determine their worth. Likewise, having less money never makes someone less deserving of kindness, dignity, or love. Judging people because they are poor or assuming they matter less because they own less only diminishes our own humanity. In the end, Miles did not reject the offer because he hated wealth, and Vivian did not earn respect because she was rich. They earned each other's respect because they chose to listen before judging, to understand before insisting, and to honor both the past and the future. Long after contracts were signed and seasons changed, the greatest legacy left in the valley was not measured in acres or dollars. It was the quiet understanding that some things become truly valuable only when they are shared with respect, protected with wisdom, and passed on with love.